Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, nice to see you all. I'm going to be giving quite a specific talk today about our game Shadowhand, and I want to go through some stuff to do with the design process in a bit of detail. We've had some really great talks here this weekend that give really good general advice, so I'm hoping that some of it will dovetail in with some specific examples that I'm going to give you today. The premise of my talk is that if you use mechanics that don't really fit your game world and story very well, it can frustrate players and break their immersion. So your mechanics and your story have to work together in harmony. I'm sure all of you would agree with that. But in this session, I'm going to show how story fed into game mechanics in our RPG game Shadowhand. And I'm going to show you also how mechanics sometimes inspired a better story. In terms of narrative design, we're going to explore how the story permeates the game at various levels, so through dialogues, tutorials and lore, and talk about how these reflect the design pillars that were laid down at the game's inception. So, a little bit about me. I've been a partner in Grey Alien Games since 2005, but I've only been having an active role in design since 2013, so I'm a relative newbie game designer with 5 years under my belt. This is myself and my husband and work partner, Jake Burkett. This is us on a typical work day. But prior to this, I've had also, and concurrent with this, I've had 20 years' experience in writing and editing. I've also shipped 2 games. Yay! This is the first game that I worked on with Grey Alien Games, Regency Solitaire. It came out in 2015 on PC and Mac, and it's a romantic solitaire card game, and it's got a linear story. It's based in Regency, England. This was really popular, and it targeted the casual download market first, before it came to Steam. This is my second game, the one I'm going to talk about today, Shadowhand. And it was released on Steam, GOG, and the Humble Store in December 2017. It's a strategic RPG card game where you duel powerful enemies in 18th century England. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the design pillars for the game. So you play as the aristocratic Lady Cornelia Darkmoor, but it turns out that she has limited power and is being taken advantage of despite being apparently quite a privileged member of society. However, when she's disguised as the outlaw highwaywoman Shadowhand, she can break the rules. This allows her to interact with criminals and other characters that a genteel lady would normally have limited access to. So on the screen here are a list of some of the words that we came up with and consulted often when we were making design decisions. So all of these, we felt, were part of this fantasy of being a highway robber, and this is at the core of the game. As well as the fantasy of being a highwaywoman, a further design pillar is time travelling to 1770. We've set this game in a genuine era in English history, and as a result, we've tried to include settings, items, and clothing that actually existed at that time. So, as well as helping with coherent world building, this also does set specific limits on the game and how we presented our game mechanics and story. So, for example, in this game, because it's set in a real time in England, there's no magic. Here's another design pillar that was very important for our game, complexity. We wanted this game to appeal to a Steam audience, and we were trying to show depth, strategy, and RPG elements. Our final design pillar that I'm going to mention today is polish. So at Grey Alien Games, we do have a reputation for making highly polished games, and this does come partly from our background in the casual games area. Polish means slightly different things to different people, depending on your discipline. But for us, polish is defined by consistency, really high level of visual and audio polish, smooth gameplay, and a real attention to detail. So here's a little bit more about the game, just so that you can understand how it works. The central premise of Shadowhand is that we're using solitaire to drive battles between the player and a range of AI enemies. So there are RPG-style stats relating to health, damage, armour, weapons, and so on. And Solitaire is by definition quite a strategic game, but that isn't necessarily how people think of it when they see it on Windows or play it in the casual sort of arena. It seems being something quite light that you could get your mum or granny to join in with. But actually it is quite strategic, and it's the first time that we know of that this type of card play has been used to drive a combat situation, so it's a little bit like a dice roll. So Shadowhand has a linear story. So despite all the complexity in some of the other areas of design, the story is actually really straightforward. Some players do really love the story. We have characters that slide on with little bits of dialogue. But from playtesting it, we also know that quite a large percentage of people do just skip the story. So this is really important to bear in mind from a design point of view. So with Shadowhand, we really wanted to evolve the concept away from it's just solitaire with a story, which was how Regency Solitaire worked, and offer more depth. So with this metagame, you have to build a better highwaywoman, and the enemies get tougher, so you have to keep managing your character stats, optimizing your loadout, equipping updated items, and all of that kind of stuff to progress successfully through the game. We had a really large number of items that you had to wear and use, and each item had associated lore which was presented on a collectible card. So this is another whole element of the storytelling in the game, that many people who wouldn't have read the main story still get a really good flavour of the environment and the time that it's set in and the type of objects that were around by reading these little snippets of lore. As far as possible, as I said, we based all the items on things that were available in 1770, so there was a lot of research that went into the game. This is what our game environment looks like, and as you can see, there's quite a lot going on the same screen. So there's plenty of information to take in. Now this calls back very specifically to our game design pillar, signalling depth and complexity. So now I'm going to talk you through a little bit, how did we actually introduce a new mechanic in Shadowhand? We have various steps that we take, so this is kind of my checklist of things to think about when we introduce a new mechanic. Now, I'm not talking here about the core mechanic of the game, which is solitaire drives battles. This is the fundamental to how the game works. What I'm talking about here is the little additional mechanics that we introduce gradually through the game to keep it interesting and introduce new puzzles and different types of fights to keep it fun. So what's a really important point to make is that we don't just introduce new mechanics by characters talking to each other in the story. Because as I said earlier, a lot of people do skip the story. That's one of the reasons that we have this layered approach where we're introducing it in lots of different ways to make sure people understand what's going on. So this is one example that I want to talk you through. It's fairly simple. We have a new mechanic that we wanted to introduce for this game that involves items hidden under large cards. And the large cards cover smaller playable cards. In effect, this means that the large card is a lock and the player is looking for a key to unlock it. So this shows what happens once you found your key and unlocked it. The big card springs away, and what you find underneath is the cards that you can play, but sometimes always a surprise item. So you might, in this case, they found a nice wanted poster for our protagonist Shadowhand, but you might find some gems or a potion you can use or something like that. So at this stage, this is just sort of an abstract concept, cards cover cards. So how do we fit it into our game from a narrative point of view? So in this case, the mechanic inspired a story about one of our characters, Captain Dread. He'd been hiding a treasure map in the graveyard, and this is a little scene where he's confiding with his ally, who's a highwayman called Rich Turnpike. Our protagonist, Shadowhand, is hiding in the bushes, so she overhears the whole conversation. So we decided that digging in the graveyard to search for a treasure map could be a mechanic that would use the large cards. We tried it out. This is what the tutorial looks like. And the very first time that we introduced the gravestone card, we put the spade, which is effectively the key, right next to it. So it's very obvious what players have to do. Going back to our design pillars, if we ask, does it fit the world and story? Is it historically plausible? Yes, it is historically plausible. Also, is this the sort of thing that a normal person would do, hang about in a graveyard at night digging up graves? Well, no, they wouldn't. So in that sense, it does sort of fit the outlaw stereotype. So we've taken the abstract concept of the lock and the key and given it meaning through the story. But it goes a little bit further than that. Oh, sorry, first I'll show you what you find underneath. So if you do remove one of the gravestones, if you're lucky, you might find a treasure map. If you're less lucky, you get some old bones. But you might get some gold or something like that as well if you're, that's okay. So we took the whole idea of the graveyard a little bit further. So when we decided on the spade as a key, it also dovetailed in with this character who you fight at the end of the level, who's a gravedigger. His weapon is a spade. So the idea of the spade and the graveyard is all woven into the story, and it actually offers the motive for the fight at the end of the story, that he's hanging out in the graveyard looking after his graves and he sees someone digging them up. That's not okay, is it? So the level in the graveyard now works coherently on our large card mechanic makes sense. Here's another quick example before I move away from the large card mechanic. This is a level set fairly late in the game that involves a formal maze, and you're wandering around this formal maze looking for your friend Mariah, who's hiding in there. So this was something that we actually struggled with a bit to fit into the game properly. When we first imagined this maze and how we would use it, we had the idea of our core mechanic of fighting enemies, and we thought that maybe our character would chop away at the maze with a sword or something. But this scenario seemed like a real stretch of the imagination, and it was taking us a really long way away from our design pillars. So to be specific, would an aristocratic lady start attacking a hedge? It was just too far-fetched, and it didn't really add either to our core fantasy of being a highway robber, which again, we had to always keep in mind those words that we saw at the beginning. It's not particularly relevant to visiting 1770 because, you know, people trim hedges whenever. And it doesn't add any polish or complexity at all. So it's not really adding anything. In other words, the mechanic didn't fit with our game pillars or strengthen our story. So what we decided to do in the end was remove fights from this hedge maze level altogether. We just turned it into a puzzle level. We used shears instead of some sort of sword to open up the hedge, which became a lock on a large card. So now it's all about finding the shears and clicking on the hedge, and there's no characters or fighting animations involved. This felt like a much better way to fit the idea that we needed to puzzle our way through the maze to find our friend, and we also added a bunch of other hard puzzles on that level as well. We didn't need to break the player's immersion by creating this unrealistic scenario with an aristocrat battling a hedge. I'm going to talk through a little bit about how story can sometimes inspire mechanics. It goes without saying that every highwaywoman needs a horse, so we found a way to introduce a horse into the story at the same time as giving our highwaywoman a charging stallion power-up. Now, this power-up could have been depicted, to be honest, in any number of ways. It's basically just something that strikes cards and destroys them. But the horse idea is a really good fit with our theme. It ties in with the be a highwaywoman aspect of our design pillars. And so this is a little bit of story explaining how Shadowhand finds the horse. She's hanging out in an outlaw hideout, and she starts off by saying, perhaps I could borrow it and reimburse the owner later. And this is really early in the game, and it's significant because she's just building up her new persona as a highwaywoman, because remember, she's an aristocrat by day and a highwaywoman by night. So in the second dialogue screen that I've shown over there, she says, am I turning thief? And then she decides that she will have the horse and she steals it. So since our games are not pure narrative games, but card games with a narrative element, a lot of players won't have read the story about the horse. So we keep coming back to this over and over again. But they still need to know what's going on in terms of the gameplay. So they immediately get a short guided tutorial, a quick pop-up that just says, this is a charging stallion, this is what it does. They also get the card immediately fully charged. And the idea is that they can try it if they want to straight away. They don't have to save up, charge it all up over layers, multiple clicks of gameplay before they can play it and play it right away. But they're not forced to. They can just dismiss the tutorial and move on if they're not bothered. So this is what happens if you use the horse. It just zooms across the screen and blasts your card away with fire. So just to triply make sure that everybody really knows what the stallion card is, if they're worried about it, how does it work, which one shall I pick, which of my power-ups shall I choose to use at this time for the best result. If you hover over it, you get a little sentence with some lore and a description of what it does. So in this way, we've got the mechanic and the story reinforcing one another over and over again, and they're also setting the right tone. It further strengthens our world building, and it keeps constantly calling back to our design pillars. Here's another little thing that you may or may not have noticed if you've played the game. This is what the screen looks like basically behind the inventory page. Watch closely. Oh! I don't know how many players noticed this detail. We didn't particularly call their attention to it, but once you've got the horse power up, you get a horse standing behind you when you're putting on your different outfits. It's just a little example of additional storytelling through art and attention to detail, and it recalls our polished design pillar. So now I'm going to run through how we messaged one more mechanic and some other related bits of gameplay. This is related to a particular character. This chap is called Lord Fleetwood, and he's the very first person that you meet in the game, and the first thing he does is hands the protagonist a gun. Also in the game, we have a shop area where you can buy new things at the end of various levels, And there's usually a little bit of story-relevant commentary that pops up as well. And Lord Fleetwood, yet again, is the one who's always selling you weapons. And he mentions in the story dialogues that he's a massive gun enthusiast. So you're sensing a bit of a theme here. By the way, can you spot the stolen horse? So it's completely in character, much later on in the game, when he invites you round to his house for a bit of shooting practice. This allowed us as designers to introduce a new set of fight rules, and this is the first time that a player has attacked an enemy that doesn't fight back and has a limited number of turns in which to destroy it. So your gun-running pal, Lord Fleetwood, explains the goal: see how quickly you can destroy the straw man. And that's what he's doing in this little dialogue here. Once you've done one level and you understand how the challenge works, he pops up again and introduces, this time, a gun-based mechanic. He offers to show you how to reload faster. The player then gets an additional dialogue that explains that when they pick up the card from the pistol suit, their gun charges faster, and that once completed, this is an ability they're going to have till the end of the game. It may seem obvious, but notice how we've included the pistol suit symbol as well as the description in our dialogue. Finally, before you leave his little armoury where you're doing your shooting practice, Fleetwood gives you a swig of something rather dubious called accuracy essence, something his apothecary made up to steady the hand and the mind. So Lord Fleetwood has basically been our guide to all things gun-related right from the very beginning of the story, even though we only really call back on this heavily by Chapter 9. He's helped to introduce a new fight scenario, a new suit-related mechanic, and a new consumable item that you can use for the rest of the game. He's woven into the story as an aristocratic character who's a trusted ally in Lady Cornelia's quest to be an outlaw. And his backstory helps to introduce gun-related mechanics. Just briefly, before we leave Lord Fleetwood, here's one for the fans. A bit of backstory relating to Lord Fleetwood can be guessed at by a couple of hints in conversations that an elderly Lady Fleetwood character has in our other game, Regency Solitaire, many years later. This older Regency Solitaire character was actually the inspiration for Shadowhand, because she hinted that she might have had a rather shady youth. These two games exist in the same world, but at slightly different locations, and in a similar area of England, but at different times. Also, if you revisit the introductory video, which is the story at the beginning of Shadowhand, it says, "Many years ago, when I was a young woman, I lived in a wild and lawless corner of England." So we're framing the story actually as an old lady looking back on her misspent youth. You can watch it on YouTube if you search under Shadowhand intro movie. As a writer, it was satisfying for me to weave little aspects of those two stories together across time and still leave just a few gaps and hints so that players can fill it in with their own imagination. For me personally, that's an element of polish. So today we've talked about several examples from our game Shadowhand, and I hope these cases from our game have given you some ideas about how story and mechanics can work together in harmony. Some of the questions we've looked at are, does the mechanic make sense in the context of the story? And is the story sparking an idea for a related mechanic? Now, you don't have to message every single mechanic in as much detail as I've shown for some of these, but it is really worth thinking carefully about that and maybe playtesting it to make sure that players really have got the message about how to use things. Importantly, it's also really okay to drop things from your design if they aren't working. I mean, don't hold on to concepts or mechanics that stray too far from the story you really want to tell. In Shadowhand, story is permeating the game at various levels, dialogues, tutorials and lore, and each of these calls back to our design pillars which support our core vision for the game. So that's it from me when it comes to talking about story and mechanics. Very briefly, I'll tell you what we're doing next. Earlier this month, we announced an unusual strategic RPG card game called Ancient Enemy. It's going to be on Steam for PC and Mac early next year. This time we've left the world of George and England, I'm afraid, but there's still a really strong British theme. It's a UK indie collaboration. It's going to be developed by ourselves, Gralien Games, along with Jim Rossignol from Big Robot, supported by Bithell Games, and it features art from Jen Patterson. It's all about being a fallen mage who awakens from centuries of slumber and has to battle folkloric foes across sprawling ghostly landscapes. And it's definitely inspired by British mythology and the Mabinogion. You can expect card battling, visceral fights, and bleak evocative folklore. That's all from me. Yes, but does anybody have a question? Don't be shy.
Mentioning playtests to figure out how... playtesting to figure out that players have really got a mechanic. How do you evaluate when you've reached that point? And what does it look like when you know you need more?
Yes, that's a good question. Basically, we playtested a very early version of the game very early on by taking it to shows. We took it to places like AdvX and watched scores of people play it. And we very quickly found out which of the things people were getting stuck on. But to be honest, we already had quite a good regime of knowing which dialogues to show from some of our earlier games and what worked. But we did send it off to a playtesting company as well, who sent back feedback about how easy they found it. And then towards the end of the game, obviously, when we had a final build, we sent it out to quite a lot of testers then as well, who logged. But watching someone play it is really the best way of seeing where they get stuck, I think. Yeah.
You said that you don't sort of force the player to use the power-up when it's first introduced, but do you set up that level in such a way that it kind of has an obvious use, so that they're encouraged to do it in that situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. It depends on what the power-up is. So that particular power-up is one that can be used in any situation, and it doesn't really matter. So if they fire it off then or later on, they're just literally getting a taste of what it does, and it won't disrupt the rest of the gameplay. But for some of the earlier levels of the game, we did have forced tutorials where we had certain card layouts where players really did have to click them in pretty much a certain order to clear the board and see how things work. So yeah, it really does depend on what the exact mechanic is we're trying to message. Anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you very much.